Hello everyone, it's Livia here, aka Story Minded, and I'm finally back with another IGCSE video. Over the next few weeks I'm going to try and get through the last fiction and non-fiction text that I have to do. Just before I start this video, someone left a comment on my previous video. I think you might be female, apologise if you're not. I went to look at your comment. I think you wanted me to make a video regarding exam structure, and I think it had something to do with the creative writing portion of the exam. I'm really sorry, for whatever reason, I went to look at your comment and the comment disappeared, so I have no idea what video you wanted me to make, but if you happen to stumble across this video, please feel free to just leave a comment and I'll do my best to help you, and that goes for anyone who watches these videos. If you have any questions or if you have any requests, please feel free to leave them because I'm happy to help. As always, I sort of stress that I'm not a teacher, I'm not a qualified teacher, but I'm a qualified TA. I'm just kind of doing this out of a passion for literature and education. And I'm currently about to go into my final year of my university degree studying English and creative writing, with the view to do my PGCE in further education to teach college age, but I'm happy to sort of delve into the world of IGCSEs and GCSE studies as well. So, okay, on to the video. So this text is written by Jamie Zeppa. They're a Canadian writer and college professor. This is an extract from an autobiography that recounts her experiences on a 2-year assignment as an English lecturer in the 1980s in the mountainous kingdom of Bhutan. It is a memoir, but it should also be classed as travel writing. It's a record of the culture and life of a Himalayan village and her initial reactions and growing attachment to this remote and unexplored part of the world. But as we get into this video, I'm going to kind of dispute or argue against some of these analogies because there's a lot of problematic areas in her views, and based on the context of the 1980s, I can kind of understand why. But we'll get into the video and I'll share some of my different views. Bhutan is a landlocked country. So landlocked means basically they don't have a coastline. In South Asia, and was not exposed to Western influences until the second half of the 20th century, which enabled it to retain much of its unique identity and charm. It is a country that has been named the happiest in Asia and the 8th happiest in the world. So that's kind of the author context background. Just before I start this video, as always, I stress it's really important that when you study literature, you don't go based on your first assumptions. But where I've studied or been exposed to quite a lot of literature over the years, and that's not in any way to say that I'm an expert, because I'm not, and that's not to say that my ideas are stronger than anyone else's. If anything, coming back to look at GCSE level texts, I have like a newfound respect for how much they throw at GCSE students in terms of the content of these texts. This text was quite difficult to generate ideas for, but I have left it a day, so as I go through this video, I've written my notes down. I'm going to have the text, and as always, I'm going to go paragraph by paragraph and just try and share my ideas with you and break down, because this is what literature is all about. It's about discussion, it's about sharing ideas, and it's really interesting, and that's why I love it so much as a subject. So as always, I'm going to sort of do the same formula I do for my videos, but if any new ideas crop up, I will share them, and that's why my videos may seem disjointed. But I feel it's important to show you the organic side of literature, because that's what literature is all about. It's discovering new ideas with a text. Okay, so, and this text is called Beyond the Sky and Earth, A Journey into Bhutan. Okay, so if I read the first paragraph. Mountains all around, climbing up to peaks, rolling into valleys again and again. Bhutan is all and only mountains. I know the technical explanation for the landscape, landmass meeting landmass, the Indian subcontinent colliding into Asia 30 or 40 million years ago, but I cannot imagine it. It is easier to picture a giant child gathering earth in great armfuls, piling up rock, pinching mud into ridges and sharp peaks, knuckling out little valleys and gorges, poking holes for water to fall through. So that's the first paragraph. I've sort of felt that it's a very sort of metaphorical description of Bhutan. It's kind of showing a sense, or starting to generate a sense, that the writer is overwhelmed by the mountainous area and environment they find themselves in. There's a lot of I think the imagery is quite mythical as well, like especially that image of, like, picture a giant child, like that metaphorical image of a giant child sort of carving the earth and creating this place. And that kind of, the imagery is very mythical. It's very mythical in its nature. It's almost like a creation myth. And a lot of primal verbs, or verbs to do with nature, like primitive verbs, have been used. So when she's describing the climbing up to peaks, rolling into valleys, rolling and climbing are quite natural movements. And the repetition of again and again, and the repetition of again and again, linking to the mountains. The structure itself sort of reflects the endless landscape, you could argue. Like, there's no end in sight, there's just all these mountains. And also within that kind of almost like creation myth analogy of the giant child carving the earth, the verbs are very aggressive, pinching and knuckling and poking, and yet there's also a kind of innocence that's been warped, because it's not just a child, it's a giant child. And obviously children are a universal symbol of innocence. And as I said before, it's kind of almost like she's overwhelmed by the scenery that's around her. But it's also this sense of being overwhelmed you could argue that this is the sort of starting point of a disengagement with this culture and this landscape. Like, it's a very she's in a very sort of observer state. She's not actually participating or exploring it. This is what she can see. She's not actually walking up these mountains. She's not actually immersing herself in the landscape. She's very much taking a back seat and looking at them. So these are kind of like her initial impressions. Okay, on to paragraph 2. It is my first night in Thimphu, the capital, a 90-minute drive from the airport to Paro. And it says in here, Paro is a valley in Bhutan that contains the country's only international airport. So once again, the whole idea of being landlocked, you're like cut off from everywhere you know and everything that's familiar, you could argue, for this writer. It took 5 different flights over 4 days to get there, from Toronto to Montreal, Amsterdam to New Delhi, Calcutta to Paro. I am exhausted, but I cannot sleep. From my simple pine-panelled room at the Drukturig, and I apologise for all my awful pronunciation, by the way, hotel, I watch mountains, how the landscape resolved itself beyond the immediate wall in front of you. Flying in from the baked brown plains of India this morning, I found out on the other side of mountains are mountains, more mountains, and more mountains again. Here's where the repetition is coming again. The entire earth below us was a convulsion of crests and gorges and winding sharpened pinnacles. Just past Everest, I caught a glimpse of the Tibetan plateau, the edge of a frozen desert, 4,500 metres above sea level. Thimphu's altitude is about half of that, but even here the winter air is thin and dry and very cold. So once again, paragraph 2, we've got the repetition of the mountains. We've got this sense of being enclosed or entrapped, especially as, once again, she's very much in the observer state. She's looking out at this landscape. She's not engaging with it. She describes like the wall. It's almost like this wall is in front of you, and beyond that it's still more mountains and more mountains and more mountains. The simple panelled door, the description of the pine door at the hotel she's staying at, is very it's very critical. It's kind of you could almost argue that it's quite a snobby, or I can't think of the right word, or a better word than snobby, but it's kind of like a I can't think of the right word at the moment, but it's like, it's a very critical and harsh view to like sort of make a comparison between, like, she's almost like looking back on her own experiences of where she's lived in Canada, and is sort of being like making that comparison of like, oh, it's a simple, and a door's a door. Like, it's those kind of little almost digs at a different environment, and it's like a door's a door at the end of the day, and yet she's pointing it out like, oh, it's a very simple door, for the interior design of the hotel. And it's just like first world problems, shall we say. And the metaphor of convulsion, when she's describing once again the almost like the creation of this landscape, convulsion is such a violent, generates very violent imagery, because a convulsion is an involuntary movement, and it's often associated with conditions such as epilepsy, when people have fits. But also it retains a concept of nature, because when obviously through childbirth, women have convulsions. When you have contractions, you convulse. So there's this element of nature that's still very much retained in her observations. And once again, it's just to talk about, there's a very harsh kind of critical tone to her writing currently. Okay, on to paragraph 3. The next morning, I share breakfast of instant coffee, powdered milk, plasticky white bread, and flavoured red jam in the hotel with 2 other Canadians who have signed to teach in Bhutan for 2 years. Lorna has golden brown hair, freckles, and a no-nonsense, home-on-the-farm demeanour that is frequently shattered by her ringing laughter and stories of wild characters that populate her life in Saskatchewan. I cannot pronounce that at all, and that's a province in Canada known for its harsh winters. Sasha from British Columbia, which is a Canadian province on the west coast containing the city of Vancouver, is slight and dark, with an impish smile. After breakfast, we have a brief meeting with Gordon, the field director of the WUSC program, which is the World University Service of Canada, a non-profit organisation that works with local bodies to strengthen the educational system and economic opportunities in Bhutan, and then walk along the main road of Thimphu. Both Lorna and Sasha have travelled extensively. Lorna trekked all over Europe and North Africa, and Sasha worked for a year in an orphanage in Bombay. They are both ecstatic about Bhutan so far, and I stay close to them, hoping to pick up some of their enthusiasm. So once again, there's this comparison to her previous life and to their enthusiasm, and this kind of like, she's a bit, not envious, that's not the right word, but she's very much aware that in comparison to the other volunteers, or not even volunteers, but the people who are going out to work there to teach, they're finding this transition easy because they're well travelled, they've experienced a lot of different places, whereas this is just drumming home that for this writer, she feels displaced. These are feelings of displacement, and once again we've got the critical tone with the being overly critical of the food she's received in the hotel, like the plasticky white bread, and like how the breakfast isn't satisfying. Once again, very much first world problems. These are very minor issues in the grand scheme of things. And you would think that if you're going to a country to teach, you would be a lot more accommodating and respectful of the place where you're going to be living for 2 years, essentially. So it's sort of that, it's very much showing that she's not engaging with the culture. She's very much disgruntled and not at all happy with her situation, and she's seeking comfort in familiarity because the other 2 volunteers are from areas of Canada, or they have connection to her own hometown, so it's seeking out that familiarity and trying to avoid the unknown as much as possible, you could argue. Okay, next paragraph. Although Thimphu's official population is 20,000, it seems even smaller. It doesn't even have traffic lights. Blue-suited policemen stationed at 2 intersections along the main road steer the occasional truck or Land Cruiser using incomprehensible but grateful hand gestures. The buildings all have the same pitched roof, refoil windows and heavy beams painted with lotus flowers, jewels and clouds. One-storied shops with wooden shuttered windows open out onto the street. They seem to be selling the same things: onion, rice, milk, powder, dried fish, plastic buckets and metal plates, quilts and packages of stale soft cookies from India bourbon biscuits, coconut crunchies and the hideously coloured orange cream biscuits. There are more signs of the outside world that I had expected. Teenagers in acid-washed jeans, Willie Nelson's greatest hits after the news in English on the Bhutan Broadcasting Service. And Willie Nelson was a well-known American musician of country music whose career was at its height in the 1970s. It says, greatest hits... Oh, no, sorry, I read that bit. A Rambo poster in a bar, the American main character from the Rambo films. Overall, these signs of cultural infiltration are few, but they are startling against the Bhutanese-ness of everything else. So, as you can see, once again, the main thing that jumped out of me at this paragraph, apart from the critical tone she is still employing, is this surprise at the lack of westernization, which is a horrific thing to want for a country. Sometimes you can think of nothing worse than westernization, and as I go on, you're going to start to see this kind of concept a lot more. Westernization, so people of cultures such as British or European, westernization is this kind of idea of like first world problems, first world issues. You kind of are in a privileged state due to your race, even if you don't feel that way yourself, and obviously times have changed, but there's this kind of very much, or even not European, but like American, all those sorts of cultures, it's very much that, or Canadian, it's that feeling a kind of superiority, like even though you have come to someone else's home, you're kind of, it's this reluctance or this refusal to engage in cultures, and it's the way she's like degrading the houses. She's like complaining that the scenery, that all the houses look the same, and I mean, that's someone's home. There are people that live in these houses, and yet she's so obsessed with the aesthetic of a country that it's just, she's missing the entire point. And it's like the lists that really drum home that she views it as being a very mundane place. Like she's listing off like, oh, all the shops sell the same thing, all they sell is rice, all they sell is dried fish, blah 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 blah, and it's just really disrespectful and quite painful to read, really. It's like, they're a landlocked country. What do you expect them to be selling? They probably don't have, if you don't have a coastline, you're self-sufficient, you have to grow crops, you have to, your delivery service is going to be very limited, isn't it? Unless you have like a plane come over and drop packaged goods. Like, you only have one airport in this entire country. It's ridiculous. Oh. Anyway, sorry, getting a bit heated, but it's just because there's just a lot of fundamentally wrong things with this text, or her views, not the text. Her views are very fundamentally wrong, but considering the context of the time, even though it was only what feels like a couple of years back, it's very damaging. Okay, so on to paragraph 5. The town itself looks very old, with cracked sidewalks and faded paintwork, but Gordon tells us that it didn't exist 30-odd years ago. Before the 60s, when the third king decided to make it the capital, it was nothing but rice paddies, a few farmhouses, and a zong. And a zong is a type of fortress found in the present and former Tibetan Buddhist kingdom of the Himalayas, particularly Bhutan and South Tibet, one of the fortresses that are scattered throughout the country. Thimphu is actually new. Thimphu will look like New York to you when you come back after a year in the East, he said. So for that short paragraph, once again, it's like talking about the cultural advancements of the place and how it's like progress will vary depending on your perspective. So she thinks her views are very much condemning, like, oh, this place, it's like all the same, there's only mountains, it's nothing special. And yet the kind of their mentor is saying, oh, wait till you go to the east side of the country, then you'll come back to Thimphu and you'll be like, oh, this place is actually, it is like New York, like a very advanced, technologically heavy society. But once again, progress varies on your perspective and on your experience. I mean, for Thimphu, they are very much advanced, and it's just this like, it's like criticism. It almost feels like criticism for the sake of criticism, and it's like nothing needs changing. That they're living their lives, like, just it's just very disrespectful and very problematic. Okay, on to paragraph 6. At the end of the main road is I cannot read this. I cannot pronounce this, sorry, I can't pronounce the first bit of the name, but it's Azong, the seat of the royal government in Bhutan, a grand, whitewashed, red roof, golden-tipped fortress, once again very much heavy on the obsession with the aesthetic, so like the artistic nature of this place. Built in the traditional way, without any blueprints or nails, beyond hamlets are connected hamlets are connected by footpaths and terrace fields. Barren now climbs steadily from the river and merge into forest. Thimphu will never look like New York to me, I think. So once again, it's the contradiction. There's a contradiction here. She's starting to be impressed by the setting, but she's still highly critical of the place she's living in, and it's just like, just accept it. Of course it's never going to look like New York, but it doesn't need to look like New York. That's the thing. It is never going to look like New York because you're in a completely different geographical location. And it's wonderful that nature is still around. Ugh, it's just very frustrating. Anyway, okay, paragraph 7. And this is where I'm going to start talking about a literature theory that I'm not an expert on, but I've learned a little bit about it due to university. But I feel like sharing these more advanced, or not advanced, that's the wrong word, these different ideas can be beneficial. So I'll explain them to the best of my ability. So once I've read this paragraph, the Bhutanese are a very handsome, the best built race of men I ever saw, wrote Emerson, who's someone like a diplomat or representative for a country, George Bogle, who was a Scottish traveller, on his way to Tibet in 1774. And I find I agree, of medium height and sturdily built, but they have beautiful aristocratic faces with dark almond-shaped eyes, high cheekbones and gentle smiles. Both men and women wear their black hair short. The women wear a kira, a brightly striped ankle-length dress, and the men a goho, a knee-length robe that resembles a kimono, except the top part is exceptionally voluminous. The Bhutanese of Nepali origin tend to be taller, with sharper features and darker complexions. They too wear goho and akira. People look at us curiously, but do not seem surprised by our presence. Although we see few other foreigners in town, we know they are here. Gordon said something this morning about Thimphu's small but friendly expat community. So here we go. So this is very much an example of Orientalism, and this is a theory in literature. I believe that it can apply to different races and different cultures. It's a very negative theory, and it's come from a background of historical like archaicness, basically. But Orientalism specifically is the representation of people in the Asian community in a stereotyped way that embodies a colonialist attitude. And colonialism is to do with the idea that you want to gain political control by occupying a place with settlers. So think back to the days when people were discovering all these new places and they would settle their English missionaries or English people, British people or American people, and you would settle your people there to try and overtake a culture and destroy it and replace it with your own, which is horrific, barbaric, disgusting. All the roots in slavery and the ideas of superiority and being a superior race, it's bound up in this. It's with the descriptions, the almond-shaped eyes. You're reducing a human being to stereotypes, and stereotypes are incredibly damaging. She is obsessed with aesthetics. The aesthetic is all to do with like the idea of settings and beauty and artificial material elements, and she's looking at their appearances and she's like, oh yes, I agree with this Scottish traveller who came all these years ago, and like I agree with his description of the Bhutanese people. It's like they're people, they are human beings. You are stripping away their individualism. You're saying they all look the same, and that isn't true. It's a very very supremacist white view that all people of different cultures look exactly the same. No, they do not. And it's a very damaging view to have. So on to paragraph 8. When we stop and ask for directions at a hotel, the young man behind the counter walks with us to the street, pointing out the way, explaining politely with impeccable English. I search for the right word to describe the people, for the quality that impresses me the most, dignity, unself-consciousness, good humour, grace, but can find no single word to hold all of my impressions. And that was a very short paragraph, but it just drums home my point. It's this limit of communication. Of course, she doesn't have the right word to describe the Bhutanese people. She is not even attempting to learn their native language. And it's this colonial attitude to not learning another person's language. It's part and parcel of all the historical slavery and racism and xenophobia, where you're just racist to another race because you fear the unknown, you fear because you don't understand that culture. And it's a very colonial attitude to have, like, oh, I'm going to be living here for 2 years as an English teacher in this country, but I'm not going to bother to learn the language of the locals who I'm going to be working with. It's very fundamentally flawed, and it's a very damaging perspective to have. And even to this day, it's awful. There's still this kind of expectation, like, I am blessed to be born British, because if I go on holiday to a different country, not that I can afford to, but if I was able to, there isn't the kind of need or necessity to learn another language, because most of the world can speak English. So it's much more difficult for someone of another culture to come over here if they haven't got English as their second language, because as a population we tend to just be like, oh well, we have no need to learn multiple languages, we can get by without it. So it's just a very damaging view to have, like, oh, I'm going to be living in this country, but it doesn't matter. Like, and that's why she's struggling to find the correct word, because there's not one available, because she's not learning their language. If she'd learnt their language, she'd be able to converse with them, and she'd be able to maybe find a word that befits them and their culture. Sorry, I'm getting very passionate about this because it's such a relevant topic even today, and it's just like, it needs to change and it needs to stop. Okay, so on to paragraph 9. In Thimphu, we attended a week-long orientation session with 12 other Irish, British, Australian and New Zealand teachers now new to Bhutan. Our first class lesson in Bhutanese history are the most interesting. Historical records show that waves of Tibetan immigrants settled in Bhutan sometime before the 10th century, but the area is thought to have been inhabited long before that. In the 8th century, the Indian saint it's really hard to read, Padmasambhava brought to the area, where it absorbed many elements of Bon, the indigenous shamanistic religion. So shamans are to do with like spirits and connection with nature and kind of the idea of spirituality. The new religion took hold, but it was not a unifying force. The area remained a collection of isolated valleys, each ruled by its own king. When the Tibetan Lama, so that's like a Buddhist monk, Ngwang Namgyel, arrived in 1616, he set about unifying the valleys under one central authority and gave the country the name Drak Yul, meaning land of the thunder dragon. Earlier names for Bhutan are just as beautiful. The Tibetans knew the country as the southern land of medicinal herbs and the South Sandalwood country. Districts within Bhutan were even more felicitously, I cannot pronounce that word, but it means like pleasingly or well chosen, named Rainbow Districts of Desires, Lotus Grove of the Gods, Blooming Valley of the Luxuriant Fruits, and the Land of Longing and Silver Pines. Bhutan, the name by which the country came to be known to the outside world, is thought to be derived from Bhutamta, meaning the end of Tibet, or from the Sanskrit Bhutan, meaning highlands. So once again, and that Sanskrit is an ancient Indian language, once again, it's sort of showing the idea that these names are beautiful, but it's a very superficial view. There's no thought or interest in learning directly from the culture of the people. It's like, you're living in this place. Why don't you go out and connect with the locals you're going to be working with? It's really sad. She's basically starting to gain an interest, but at a very superficial level. She's overlooking the horrific, like, there were wars that were fought trying to unify a country, and it's kind of like glossing over all of the probably political tension, the fighting, the bloody side of history, the dirtier side of history. It's just overlooking all of that, and she's just obsessed with, oh, but these names of these places are so beautiful. And it's like, if you think it's so beautiful in your own language, why don't you attempt to learn the language of the locals and say the names in their language? It's like, it's just such a reductionist thing to do. You're just reducing this culture to names and beauty, and you're not engaging with the culture. You're just kind of like, it's this whole fact that she remains an observer. She's not a participant in this culture, and that's not to be confused with obviously cultural appropriation, where another culture steals another culture and sort of passes it off as their own or claims it. But you would think she would become a bit more involved with the locals she's going to be working with, and actually try and gain a sense of the culture directly, rather than just being like, oh, I'm going to sit down and like learn a lesson about the history of this place, rather than actually going out to physically experience it for yourself. It's like the equivalent of if you, say, for example, went to the concentration camp Auschwitz and you stayed in your hotel and you read the diaries of Anne Frank and didn't go to visit Auschwitz. It's like the historical site of horrific human tragedy is right on your doorstep, but no, you're just going to stay and read Anne's diary when you could actually go physically visit the place where she was. It's just like, it doesn't make sense. Okay, paragraph, and this is the final paragraph. While the rest of Asia was being overrun by Europeans of varying hue but similar cry, once again a very colonialist view. It's like, no, they're all different. Similar hues are to do with colours. So she's basically saying, but this time about in terms of the Europeans. So I guess that's a nice inversion. She's now sort of reducing Europeans to looking all the same, although earlier she was doing that to the people of Bhutan, so it's a bit like, it's a bit too late now, love. Only a handful of Westerners found their way into Bhutan. 2 Portuguese Jesuits, which are like members of the Roman Catholic order devoted to missionary work, and missionary work is one of the classic colonial examples of like, we'll send our missionaries out and we'll convert the savages. It's ridiculous, but that's what people used to believe, and I bet some people still do, unfortunately. Came to call, and it's the nonchalance of this paragraph. They're like, oh, they came to call, although it might be it could be irony here, but by this point, I don't trust this writer. By this point, I'm thinking you have some very warped views. Came to call in 1627, and 6 British missions paid brief but cordial visits from the late 1700s. Cordial is friendly and polite. In the late 1700s until the middle of the next century. Relations with the British took a nasty turn during the disastrous visit of Ashley Eden in 1864, and apparently they were an official and diplomat in India under British rule. Eden, who had gone to sort out a small problem with the Bhutanese raids on the British territory, had his back slapped, his hair pulled, and his face rubbed with wet dough, and was then forced to sign an outrageous treaty that led to a brief war between the British and the Bhutanese. Considering the consolidated British Empire in the south and the great game being played out in the north between the colonial powers, and the great game is the economic and political conflict between the British Empire and the Russian Empire for supremacy in Central Asia in the 19th century. So bigger countries muscling in, being like, we want to control this place for our own empire, and it's like, no, that's wrong. Being played out in the north between the colonial powers, Bhutan's preservation of its independence was remarkable. I am full of admiration for this small country that has managed to look after itself so well. So that's her conclusion. So I guess you could say she has learned something, but I have a lot of... Some people might want to view that as she has learned, she has improved, but I still feel she has a lot more to learn. And granted, this is probably when she was first visiting this country and she was settling in, but it's very nonchalant. She's brushing over this horrific event. Like, the Great Game sounds horrific. I've never even heard of this historical event, to be fair, and it happened back in the 19th century, so the 1800s. But that's still, like, she's glossing over it. She's not really going into she's spent more time about the aesthetics of this country, focusing on the setting and the scenery, than actually going into the horrific historical side of it. And she sort of claims that she now has this newfound respect for this country, but after all that I've read, I kind of feel like it leaves me feeling that it's much more of it seems, even if she's not meaning to me as the reader, it has now left me feeling like it's a very condescending tone, or almost patronising, like, oh, the fact that little Bhutan was able to keep its independence, it's like, oh, it's so impressive, and it's like, you're living in this country, why are you not engaging with it more? But those were just some of my thoughts, and this is a very long video, but hopefully you can gain something from this. If anyone's watched this, thank you, and I hope to make another video soon. Please feel free to leave any questions and I'll get back to you. Thank you. Bye.